lovelies, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Heather, and this is the happenings with H.A.P. That was weird. Hello! So this makeup is definitely a choice, and I am sticking to it. I got my little Nickelodeon earrings in to kind of match the orangey green thing that I got going on. I don't know. In this video, I'm going to be covering my recent reads. And I use the air quotes because this is going to cover all of my reading that I never made wrap-up videos for from March all the way through August. So that is a lot of books. If you've not seen my update and / book haul that I posted about where I've been and what I've been up to, you can watch that video up here. I very much acknowledge that I have been very quiet on this channel and I want to kind of get away from that. But I also didn't want to neglect the books that I read all of these months. So I'm not going to be going into a formal wrap up for each book because A, for a lot of them, it's been a while since I've read them, so I definitely do not remember all of the details, and B, this video would be like 3 hours long because we all know my wrap-ups, no matter how much I try, are always way too long. I wanted to give these books at least some of their due because some of them I really loved a lot and definitely are going to go on my favorite books of the year list at the end of the year, and some of them are definitely going to go on some of my least favorite books of the year. So with that said, let's get into it. I'm gonna go kind of by month and try to get through this as quickly as possible. So yeah, let's get started. So February was the last month that I actually had a true wrap up for. So if we go to March, one book that I will not really talk about here because I made an entire reading vlog review video for was Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare. You can watch that video up here. It is a lot of tears, a lot of laughter, a lot of oh my gods. So recommend that video. Loved it, was a 5-star. The next book that I had read in March was Nick by Michael Farris Smith, and this was supposed to be a historical fiction prequel to The Great Gatsby that follows Nick Carraway. I had very high hopes for this. Great Gatsby is something that I had really liked reading because I like that era of America. 1920s is always really just fun to read about in historical fiction. Unfortunately, I had to give this book 2.5 stars. I really enjoyed the parts where Nick was like in World War I as a soldier and his time in France and just how he kind of goes through the world. And up till the end of that point, I was like, okay, this is definitely probably going to be a good solid 4 stars. I was very much enjoying it. And then he goes to, I believe it's New Orleans. And once again, he is a background character or side character in what's supposed to be his own story. So he deals with another set of people that are having issues, much like Gatsby and Daisy and all that drama. So this book was supposed to be billed as like, you know, telling his story and how he got to where he was. And aside from his time in France as a World War I soldier, we don't see that because literally the New Orleans plot is just him on the side observing all these fucking crazy people. So I was very disappointed because then once he ends that, then he like heads for New York and then it basically goes right into the beginning of The Great Gatsby. I didn't really know anything more about the character, which is what this was billed as. So I had to give it a 2.5 stars. Like, it was written well, and the first part of the book was really great, but then it kind of just really sank downhill really quickly. The next book I read in March was Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo, which is the 3rd book in the Grisha trilogy. I gave this one a 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it. My biggest gripe with it was just kind of the ending. And I don't want to spoil this one because it is part of a trilogy and it's the last book in a trilogy, and for those that haven't read it, I just didn't really like the ending and how the main pairing ends their lives. Other than that, I really enjoyed it. I liked the adventure, but it still is not one of my favorite series. I can understand why it's popular, but it's just some of the character choices I didn't love. This one, in compared to the 2nd book, not much really happens because you're kind of finalizing everything. Yeah, like it was an enjoyable read. I'm glad I read all the trilogy because I did watch the Netflix show after, because that was a big reason I read it in the first place, was because of the show. And I'm glad I did because that helped inform me as I watched the show. Yeah, would I probably read this series again? I don't think it would probably be on my list of rereads, unfortunately, but I enjoyed the time that I spent reading it, and I can definitely understand why people love it. The last book I read in March was Fat Chance Charlie Vega by Crystal Maldonado, and this was a definite 5 stars. I really loved this book. I love Charlie as a character, and I really connected with her because she is plus size, and that informs a lot of how she views the world and how she believes people view her as a woman, as well as how people actually do view her. The romance was really great in this, and I just really loved this book so much. My biggest trigger warning for this book was the treatment of her mother towards her, because Charlie is mixed race Latina, her mother is white, and her mother's obsession with weight after the passing of her father and just how she kind of thrusts that on Charlie is just very triggering. So there's some moments of definite psychological abuse, and not as much physical, but a little bit. So that part I would definitely kind of go into this book knowing that in advance, because I didn't know that, and thankfully I don't have that type of a relationship with a parental figure. But if you do, just something to keep in mind, because it could be definitely triggering. On the whole, I really did love this book so much. It was one of my few 5 stars so far of the year. I've not had that many, and I really loved the way it was written. I love Charlie as a character. It was just all just so great, and I'm so glad that I got to read it and that it lived up to the expectations. Moving into April, I started out completing the Grisha-verse, at least up to a certain point, with the Six of Crows duology, which is Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, both by Leigh Bardugo. I gave both of these books 3.5 stars. I didn't love it as much as I thought I would. I don't know why. I think because of the hype on book 2 with this duology in particular, because it's definitely more hyped up than the Grisha-verse in general. But the Six of Crows duologies has been hyped up for years. I liked it okay, and there was definitely moments. I really did love the character development and stuff like that. And I loved the inclusion of all different types of characters in this series. Nina is a plus size character, which is amazing. And Nina and Matthias's romance is just probably my favorite in the books, just because of how much it grew. But obviously Kaz is a really fun character, and Nej is a great character. The characters are really great. I just didn't love the plot. I think that's what I didn't really like about it. I will say that the Crows were my favorite part of the Netflix series. I was surprised at how they wove both series together, but they were the standouts in that series. So I mean, I'm glad that I read it so I can get a bit of a background on them, but I don't know, the books themselves I didn't really love, but I love the characters, so it was one of those. Wonderful world building, beautifully written, all of that. It's just something about it I didn't love as much as I hoped I would, and I think it was kind of a death by hype type of situation. But again, 3.5 is still really good. I really did enjoy it. It just didn't live up to the expectation that I hoped it would have. Definitely would recommend for the characters alone, because the characters are really great. The last book I read in April was The Project by Courtney Summers, and this one I gave a solid 4 stars. Courtney Summers is the same author of Sadie, and this is about 2 sisters, one of whom ends up in a cult, and it's the other sister trying to find out what happened to her sister. I really loved the dual timeline storytelling in this. Courtney Summers has a really wonderful way of writing about sisters. I am an only child myself, but the relationships between siblings aren't always, so beautifully rainbows and butterflies or tragically bad. They're usually somewhere in between, and she writes that so well. Then the description of the cults and what happens and how Lo actually kind of gets pulled in herself. There's so much. Definitely trigger warnings for torture, rape, and all these other bad things. So definitely, if that bothers you, don't probably read this one, or at least go in knowing that it can be very triggering. It's just as dark as Sadie, probably a little bit more so just because of the depiction of the torture. But yeah, very disturbing. Much like Sadie as well, it does not have the happiest of endings, unfortunately. Man, she knows how to write a mystery. I was very engaged the whole time. I listened to this on audiobook as well, and the audiobook readers were fantastic. Yeah, I preferred Sadie a little better, but I really did love this because it was on my anticipated reads for 2021, and it definitely lived up to it, and it's really great, but just definitely go in with the knowledge of what it is about, basically. So May started out with a book that's been on my TBR for years. I first heard about it from Mel to the Any, I think when she had an arc. So That's how long ago this was, but it is well met by Jen DeLuca, and it is an enemies to lovers romance that is set in a Renaissance fair, and everything about it was just perfection. I really liked Emily's character, because usually main female protagonists, they can be very hit or miss, where they're like too much I'm not like other girls trope, and it just can be not great. But no, I really liked Emily a lot. She actually was dealing with stuff. It wasn't just some random like, oh, woe was me type of stuff. The duality of Simon as this like very stern school teacher who runs this Renaissance fair, and the pirate that he plays in the Renaissance fair was so fun. Like, I really love them as a couple. It definitely got a little steamy towards like the middle, which was really great because that's what you want in one of these contemporary romances. But it was so fun, and I am very much looking forward to the sequels. I did read one of them, but there's another one coming out in, I believe it's October, so I'm super excited for that one because I really just love this little universe, and they're very quick reads, but they're really fun. And just if you are in the mood for a contemporary romance, I recommend picking up this book. It was everything that I hoped it would be and more. Like, if you like Renaissance fair and small town life type of stuff, it's great. The next book I read was Sing Me Forgotten by Jessica S. Olson, and this I gave a solid 3 stars. So this was a kind of gender-bent Phantom of the Opera retelling following Isda, who takes on the kind of phantom role. But she has a magical sort of power where she can extract memories from people, and it's considered a very dangerous power, and she's also disfigured because of the type of power that she has. My biggest thing with it, the magic system was a little complex. I don't want to say it was unnecessary, it just added really nothing to the plot, because when something huge happens to Emmerich, who is the love interest of Isda, something that should be catastrophic is fixed. I don't know, it just was not what I thought it would be. I almost would have rather had just actually like a straight gender bent Phantom of the Opera retelling instead of this other magical elements. The magical elements just kind of took me out of it. It does still end not happily, because any Phantom of the Opera retelling shouldn't. Isda as a character, I didn't love her that much. It was fine. Maybe I hyped it up to myself too much. I don't know, but I really was expecting more from it. Like I said, it was fine. It was written well. The author tried, but it wasn't, if you're going into it hoping for like, you know, a really great Phantom of the Opera retelling, honestly, if you want anything Phantom of the Opera related, just read Phantom by Susan Kay, and that will totally help you, because I was not a fan of this one. I would definitely like to read Phantom of the Opera retellings that are really good, so if you know of any, please suggest them. This one for me just wasn't it, unfortunately. The next book I read was a solid 5 stars. I absolutely adored it, and it was Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. It was such a great mystery love story. The world was so rich and so creative. Like, I was waiting to read this book, I think during like maybe September, October, but I decided, because I really didn't know what else to read after Sing Me Forgotten, and I was like, you know what? Let me read this. Why not? I've heard great things, and I just absolutely loved it. The book follows Yadriel, who is a trans boy, and him trying to assimilate into his family of brujos. Because he was mistakenly assigned female at birth, his family kind of expects him to be a bruja and not do the same type of magic that a brujo would do. But he wants to show his family that he is a brujo, and the goddess that they get their powers from also sees him as a brujo. In the midst of this, he accidentally resurrects a ghost of Julian Diaz, who was a bad boy at his school, and the plot basically follows him and his cousin Maritza trying to get Julian to cross over, but Yadriel develops feelings for Julian, and it's just such a beautiful story. Like, the mystery involved in it too, of like what was happening, was also like totally unexpected. Like, there were so many layers to this. Like, I absolutely loved it. I loved all the side characters. It was so wonderful. Like, I really, really recommend this book so much. It's definitely one of my favorite books of the year. Now that we are getting into fall and the spooky season, highly recommend reading this book and having it on your TBRs if you don't already. I feel like you will definitely love it, because it was just so good. The last book I read in May was My Plain Jane, which is written by the Lady Janies, Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. This was fun. This was a solid 4 stars for me. I did not love it as much as My Lady Jane, mostly because that one was way more satirical and funny, whereas this one was more of kind of a straight story. It loosely follows Jane Eyre, but Jane in this can see and speak to ghosts, and she gets involved in this ghost hunting society and meets up with Mr. Rochester, but things don't go anything like the book. It was really fun, but definitely more of a straight novel, kind of like with gothic elements and some comedy, compared to My Lady Jane, which was just straight up absurd comedy. But really loved it, and I'm really looking forward to finishing out the Lady Janies trilogy with My Calamity Jane, which is about Calamity Jane, and then starting on My Contrary Mary, which is about Queen Mary, Mary Stuart, who is one of my favorite historical figures of all time, so I definitely know her story very well. But definitely really love this series because it's just so fun to play around with historical figures as well as known classics. Like, I definitely recommend this one, especially if you really like Jane Eyre, just because it does do a fun twist, and you think it's gonna go one way and it doesn't. So if you know Jane Eyre, I think it makes it even more fun than if you went in cold, but I think you could still go in cold without knowing the story of Jane Eyre and still appreciate it. Yeah, definitely love this one a lot. So June started out with a novella, This Is How You Lose a Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This one I gave a 2.5 stars. And the reason I did was because it just wasn't the book for me. It's about Red and Blue, who I believe are two women identifying characters from different time periods, and they basically are kind of trying to entrap the other one, and writing letters to each other that end up kind of developing into them developing feelings for each other without ever having met each other. So it does have a very beautiful premise, and like I said, it was gorgeously written. It just, I'm not a big poetry person. For instance, I really love Elizabeth Acevedo's writing. However, I usually don't rate her books the highest just because I'm not a huge fan of poetry in general. Just doesn't, it makes me sound terrible. When I read a novel, like, I want to read prose, if that makes sense. So like, I like to have everything fleshed out, and that's what I was missing from this book, was just a fleshing out of the world. Like, I wanted to know what started this, how the science worked, how the time travel worked. Like, I wanted to know more about these characters because I did like these characters, but I just didn't know much about them to get that as invested as I would normally. So that's why I kind of had to rate it low. But for someone that really does enjoy poetry within writing, and gorgeous writing at that, I think you would really like this. If you're not even a sci-fi fan, I think you would really like this because it definitely doesn't lean into the sci-fi that much, just very much on the surface. But that's kind of how I felt when I read it. I was seeing the world through a very small lens, and I couldn't see the peripherals, and I wanted to know what was going on in the peripherals. So like I said, this one wasn't for me, but I can definitely see why other people really would love it. I actually heard about it from Haley in Bookland because she really loved it. So I was like, ooh, let me try to read this. And she kind of gave the same caveat of, if you don't like poetry, you might not like this one. So just keep that in mind. But I definitely think it's worth reading. It's very short. I did the audiobook and that was like 3 hours. So it's doable to do in a day. Even if you might not like it, you'll get through it really quick. So the next book I read in June was a most anticipated read for me, and it was a 5-star, like I figured it would be, and that is One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston, who is the author of Red, White, and Royal Blue, a book that was on my top list from last year that I read, and I just loved this story so much. I really love the characters, and not just August and Jane, but also the supporting characters. And that goes the same with her previous novel. Like, even the supporting characters are really wonderful, and this whole world that was built was really great. It was a really fun premise. August meets Jane sporadically on her trips to and from school on the Q train, and they start to fall in love, and she realizes that Jane is stuck from the 70s on the Q train. So it's some sort of weird time loop that she is stuck in, and she cannot physically get off the train. It definitely has like a little sci-fi time travel in there, and you kind of discover a bit more about Jane's past as well as August's past, and it was such a fun love story that had really steamy scenes as well, because Casey McQuiston can write really good steamy scenes, I will say, both in Red, White, and Royal Blue and One Last Stop. So if you're into that and your contemporary romances, she's good at them. These are definitely not young adult books. Really love this one. I figured I would just based on the premise alone. I love that August is also portrayed as a curvy, bordering on plus size girl. Again, we don't see that much. And I have a bunch of books that I've read this year that have featured characters like that, and I love it so much because it is a representation we don't get a lot of. So really love it. Highly recommend if you're looking for a really fun contemporary sapphic romance. This is definitely it. The next book I read in June was also a very highly anticipated one for me, particularly for the audiobook, and that was You Love Me by Carolyn Kepnes, which is the third book in the You series. And just like before, the audiobook was read by Santino Fontana, who I adore listening to in audiobook form so much. And Joe is back being crazy as ever. I gave this one 3.5 stars. I didn't love it as much as the first and the second one, just because it kind of got a little crazy towards the end. But it was still so great to be back in his weird ass head. He's actually in this one now that he has been released from jail. He is trying to make amends, but he still kind of falls into old patterns because of course he does. This book is for a very specific audience. If you like the rest of the You series or you like the You series on Netflix, I really recommend these books. No one wants a boyfriend like Joe. He is toxic as hell. He's a murderer, a serial killer, really. But man, he's fun to read and fun to be inside his head. And that's why I really like Santino Fontana's reading, because like that is Joe's voice. But yeah, this is just such a fun series. There is going to be a fourth book apparently, and I am super excited for it because I just love me some Joe Goldberg. So definitely recommend this if you are a fan of the series. July, I started with The Guinevere Deception by Kiersten White. Kiersten White wrote one of my favorite books, which was The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. So I was really looking forward to this one. However, this one only got a 3.5 stars from me. It is a retelling of the Arthurian legend about Arthur, Guinevere, Merlin, and all that. I just didn't find Guinevere to be a very interesting character. Like, the plot that was happening around her was cool, but because of, I don't want to give anything away, because of who her character is, most of it is spent just kind of being exposed to this world that she's trying to navigate. And she does have like a mission to protect Arthur, but otherwise, I don't know. It's just, she's very unaware a lot of the time, and not in a good, like, I want to say like Harry Potter sort of way. She's just oblivious. So like, I liked where it was going. There is another book in the series. I think it's going to be a trilogy. The second book is out now. So I'll probably still read it, but I'm not like racing to read it because I didn't love it as much as I hoped I would. It was fine. It was a fine book, but not nearly as good as Elizabeth Frankenstein was, because that one was just fantastic. So if you're a fan of Kiersten White, I think you probably would like this, but if you've read Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein and you loved it, you might not love this one as much. The next book on my list was another very anticipated read, and that was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I of course gave this one a 5 stars. I absolutely loved this book. I will say that I prefer Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones a bit more than this one, but I still really love this one. I think of all of her books, Evelyn Hugo is my favorite, followed by Daisy Jones in the 6th, but this one was still a really fun read. It is a back and forth timeline book about the Riva children and the courtship of their parents in the 50s, and the Riva children are currently in the 80s. The 80s timeline takes place during one night at this very epic party at the eldest Riva's mansion, while the earlier storyline follows the courtship of their parents. This book seems to be very polarizing. People either really love it or they really hate it, because at the end of the day, there's a revelation that's revealed, because I feel like that's kind of something that happens in Taylor Jenkins Reid books, especially the big three, which are Malibu Rising, Evelyn Hugo, and Daisy Jones. But not as much happens, and there was really not as big of a resolution in this one compared to the other two. So I can understand why people might not like it, because like most of her books, these people are all very much layers of gray, some darker layers than others. They all do pretty terrible things, again, some more than others, and people's lives get fucked up because of other people's decisions. I've read the audiobook version of it, but even still, like, stuff would happen and I would just be like, you know, like angrily yelling at my phone just based on what was happening. So if I was reading it physically, I'd probably be yelling at the book just because of the decisions characters make or things that end up happening that aren't surprising. Very toxic relationships in this, but that's kind of her bread and butter, so it kind of works. But it's just something about it, I don't know, something about her writing, something about her character development I just really like, even if I don't necessarily love the characters themselves, but they are very much people, and I think that's what I really like about her writing. So if you're a Taylor Jenkins Reid fan, I don't see why you wouldn't like this book. Again, I would not place it as high as Evelyn Hugo or Daisy Jones, but definitely within a higher portion of her canon for sure. The last book I read in July was Well Played, which is the second book in the Well Met trilogy by Jen DeLuca. And this follows Emily's friend Stacy from the first book. We only get very brief glimpses of Stacy in the first book, so it was really great to explore her character in the second one. She's very much one of those who kind of had those hopes and dreams and ended up still staying in the small town for reasons that were out of her control. And her luck in love mostly leads to just kind of sexual escapades, so I can very much relate to Stacy in a lot of ways. And I don't want to give away the plot element because it doesn't actually show in the synopsis, unlike the first one, but there's a lot of miscommunication in regards to her and her eventual love interest in this one. I gave this one a 4.5 stars, and it was primarily just based on how some of the revelations were handled, because it could be very awkward, just because I feel like people probably wouldn't react that way in real life, but that's me being very nitpicky. I still really love this book. It was so fun. It was great to be in that world and obviously see the extension of Emily and Simon's relationship and their lead up to their marriage. So like really fun, really enjoyed it. I'm not sure who is going to take the center stage in the third book. I think I have an idea. I believe based on the cover, it looks to be Mitch, which will be very interesting because all the other books have had female protagonists, so that'll be very interesting. But I really enjoyed this one. This one was a lot of fun, and the relationship between her and her eventual romantic partner was really great as well, and I just really love the series. Like, it's just a fun contemporary romance series, and I highly recommend it. Okay, so we are finally in August. I swear we are soon done. August saw me reading a lot of plays because I was on the search for monologues. As I mentioned in my update video, I have been acting again. So I read Period of Adjustment, Summer and Smoke, the 2-character play, and Suddenly Last Summer by Tennessee Williams, as well as Mary Page Marlowe by Tracy Letts. I read all of them within like maybe a 2-day period because they're plays and plays can be read fast. So I'm not really going to go into those because while I gave them star ratings on Goodreads, reading a play and watching it being performed is not the same. So I'm not going to go into the ratings for those, but I did read them, so they added to my book count. Because of being home and not having to commute, my book count is quite low compared to last year. So I read those and I thoroughly enjoyed all of them, some more than others, I'll say that. And I did actually end up finding some monologues from them, so that made me very happy. Then my actual book in August that I read was The Conductors by Nicole Glover. This was on my most anticipated reads of 2021 list, and unfortunately I had to give it a 3 stars. I really was on board when I first started reading it. It is about a husband and wife team who worked on the Underground Railroad to lead people from the South to the North. They were former slaves themselves, and the book is actually told in 2 timelines, the current present timeline as well as their past and how they got to where they are. What the most intriguing thing about this one was the fact that there is a magical element and they are able to do magic, and it's very much in regards to celestial magic. And in the present day timeline of the book, it deals with a mystery of why these certain people are ending up dead. And like I said, I was on board for it. My biggest thing was just that not much really happens. We do get the revelations at the end of what happened and who was behind everything, but like, I don't know, I felt like I went through a lot of the book and it was just them kind of trying to figure some stuff out, but not very engagingly. And the magic system could have been explored more, in my opinion. Yeah, I don't know. Like, for instance, white people are typically the ones that have wands, whereas African Americans don't, and African Americans aren't really allowed to show that they know how to do magic because, you know, it's something that they could be arrested for. So the magic system is ingrained into the Restoration period and Jim Crow in this era. I don't know, like I think I expected more from it. I thought it'd probably be a bit more exciting, adventurous than it was. I don't really know. Like, I just don't know why I didn't really like it. Like I said, 3 stars isn't bad. It's just, it wasn't my favorite, and I was very disappointed in the fact that it wasn't. I think I expected more and I maybe hyped it up a bit, but definitely from the beginning I was very much engaged, but then it's just like things kept just not really happening and it continued. So like we would get snapshots of the past. I'm like, cool, that makes sense. But then we go back to the present and it's just like, okay, still nothing's really happening and they're kind of going about their day to day. I know this is probably going to be a polarizing review because there's people that really love this book and I can definitely understand why. I think maybe this is one of those that would be better read physically than on the audiobook. The audiobook narrator was fantastic, but it just, some books translate better sometimes, and like maybe I need to read it slower and just kind of pay attention more, because I definitely pay attention with audiobooks, but sometimes you may lose some details unless you're like super engaged, and maybe this is just one that didn't keep me engaged from an audiobook standpoint. I enjoyed it, and there are going to be more books in the series. I just don't know if I'm going to continue them, unfortunately. And the final book that I read in August, which will conclude this mammoth video, my voice is already sore and hoarse, is Wild Woman and the Blues by Denny S. Bryce. This one was also on my most anticipated reads list for 2021. And this one was also one that I didn't love as much as I hoped. I gave this one a 3.5 stars, so it's not bad by any means. And I want to say halfway through the book of this one, I was really on board. I really love the world building. It's told in two perspectives. Sawyer is a young filmmaker who's getting, I believe, his PhD, and he's working on this film about Oscar Michaud, and he knows of a chorus girl who is still alive from Chicago in the 1920s that he believes is in this lost Michaud print. So he goes to talk with her, and she's like 115. And then the alternate storyline is in the 1920s, I believe 1925 is when it starts. And it follows Honore, who is this chorus girl that Sawyer is going to meet in the present day. Then we kind of get into this plot line of her with her lost love coming back and getting involved with like Al Capone and his gangsters. And this suffered from nothing really happening. So the entire past plot is about 3 months worth, so it's I think from October to January 1st, 1926. So a couple months span. The epilogue, however, covers about 20 years of plot. As I said, nothing really happens. Everything that Honore was trying to do in the first third of the book is completely forgotten and never explored again. And then she suddenly goes to Paris and is able to be successful. So it's very strange and is never really explained. And then the plot twist in the present day that we find out is also never really explained by the character. It's just like, oh, this happened just because I wanted to. And it's like, okay, this book had so much promise and I don't understand what really happened. I would have rather have, gotten to see Honore later on and how she established herself, especially going through like World War II where she was located. Like all of these things could be explored because the jazz age in like Paris in the 1930s and 40s is like, that's rife for wonderful content. It's like a historical fiction breeding ground, essentially. There's so much that happened at that time in that place. And there's also so much that happened in Chicago in the 1920s as well, and that just wasn't really explored. And I'll be honest, like the characters I didn't really love. I liked Honore, but again, like she wasn't given anything to do. Like all of her ambitions kind of just go out the window. And yet she's still able to be successful without really explaining how or why. I don't know. It was a letdown. I primarily gave it a 3.5 because of like those first bunch of chapters. But yeah, like it seems to be kind of a common thread based on other reviews I looked at on Goodreads after I finished, that it's just this book had so much potential and just didn't explore it because literally nothing really happens. The crux of the book is what Sawyer discovers later on, and there's one inciting incident in the past, but then even still, everything with that turns out well. Like it's odd. I don't know. And then like the epilogue was rushed with 20 years of content. So it was disappointing. I know it probably sounds like I should rate this lower, but it was written very well. It was purely about plot for me. I wish I liked it better. I'm talking about it so much because it's the most recent thing I've read. I'll definitely read the author's next book because I did enjoy the writing, but I just wanted more. So it was a little disappointing in that way, especially because a lot of these books that were my most anticipated turned out to not be 5 stars, which is very odd for me. So that is it. That is my mammoth video recapping all of the books I've read since March. It went way longer than I had hoped or expected, but it is what it is. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm planning on having more timely wrap-ups like before. If you enjoyed this video more than the wrap-ups, let me know, but I'll just have to actually take better notes because there was definitely the older ones I definitely didn't remember much anymore because it's been so many months and so much stuff has happened. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I will see you in my next video. Bye!